This is Coffee as Collaboration. Hooray. Advance, please. I've been up since 10 last night because I'm still jet lagged. So we're going to talk about coffee because that's exactly what we need right now. It's a little bit too early for beer. But there's more to it. We got an electric kettle brewing back there. I don't know if you can hear it. It's like a Chekhov's gun. You'll get to it eventually. Craig, tell me about Heroku.
So Heroku, if you're not familiar, we're a platform as a service. But really what I want to do is kind of set some context. So why do you care what we have to say? Why do we have anything to say about craft or scaling that or scaling engineering? So I like to think we're a pretty productive company overall, especially on the engineering side. So these numbers are a little old now. I pulled them about 4 months ago, but we're 85 people, 21 teams. We have across those 85 people, 5,000 Heroku apps. I mean, some of these are dev and staging, but 5,000 apps in total. We do 500 releases a day, 200 deploys a day, and we have over 100 public GitHub repos. And I don't know if the GitHub guys are here yet, but I just want to point out that we have more public GitHub repos than they do. So take a little jab while I can get it there. But essentially, we ship a lot of code. We ship a lot of things. We have engineers that enjoy shipping code, and I think that's a core part of what we believe in and what we care about. And I think I look at the 200 deploys a day, and I'm actually not that pleased with it. I feel like we should be doing a lot better. But that's having been there and seeing that we're actually slowing down from what we used to be. So how do we get back to a lot of that, and how do we keep that kind of momentum up? So there's a few kind of core things at Heroku that we believe in. So the first is move fast and improve over time. And I actually kind of like to think of this as move fast and break shit. Who cares if something breaks if you fix it quickly? Don't worry about running a 20-minute integration test to see if something works before you deploy, because you're not going to be deploying 200 times a day then. It's just not going to happen. Experiment constantly at small scale. And I mean this in a variety of ways. So we have 21 teams. Most teams are 3 to 4 people. So there's small teams doing things. It's common for us to create task forces to go and solve one problem, create that team, and then dissolve the team shortly after. So there's a lot of movement amongst teams, around teams, basically solving a problem with a team and then moving on. But at the same vein, we're experimenting, really, really small testing constantly. So not big site-wide changes, but smaller A/B tests, testing things that work with users, and aggressively killing things that don't work so that we don't have quite as much code to maintain. And then focus on great experiences. And hopefully this comes through in a lot of things in the product, but in the engineering, and in the beer we drink, and the food we eat, and the coffee we make. I think this is just part of our core culture, which will ring through a little bit more in some other places.
Right. So let's talk about perspective as a developer. So speaking as a developer, there's sort of a yin and yang of your career experience, right? On one hand, you're going to spend a lot of time heads down working. But you can't just do that. If you're functioning inside an organization, you're going to need to communicate with people. But those are complementary parts of your entire occupation. Too much balance, or too much of one side, and you're just in meetings all the time. You don't actually get to do any work. Too much work, and you don't actually get to benefit from that. Nobody benefits because you aren't documenting it. So you have to strike this balance. And I think part of scaling your craft, scaling a company, is making sure that people strike that balance. So let's talking about working. There was a Peopleware is a very famous book. Did a survey of developers to figure out best working practices and trends. And one of the things that really struck us is that when polled, engineers asked, how many of you are interrupted regularly? If you look at the top performing engineers, that percentage is 38%, which is astoundingly and embarrassingly high, that we're interrupted regularly. It doesn't allow us to do our job. 76% of bottom performers reported this. And of course, this doesn't necessarily imply causation, but at least there is a strong correlation between being interrupted constantly and not being able to do your job. And in fact, if we think about flow, and this is common for anybody that is a developer and understands what flow is, if you get interrupted, that's 20 minutes, up to 20 minutes that you've lost to get back to where you were. So that one phone call, that one person tapping you on your shoulder, that one thing that's just bugging you, that sound, across the office, that's going to, derail you, and it's going to take a while to get back. This is a real cost. And the net effect of this is that, as reported in this book, the average developer gets 2 hours tops of, undisturbed time to develop every day. That's a normal 8-hour workday, right? Or if it's a developer 12-hour workday. That's really embarrassing. So that's the status quo. So how we do things at Heroku, it's to protect and defend developers' time and make sure that we're optimizing for that.
So Matt, we were just talking in the back right before this, and Matt was commenting on this, that it was, 2 hours of uninterrupted time is kind of the average. And he said, essentially I feel like it's a bad day if I have anything less than 4. Basically 4 hours of sitting in front of a terminal, coding, getting things done, shipping code, which is, I think, one thing that an engineer cares about at the end of the day. And I think that just reinforces, engineers want to build things, so the best thing you can do is let them build things.
Absolutely. I get grumpy without my 4 hours. So we have 3 rules, 3 things to comment on. First is the headphone rule, when we're going to talk about caves and commons, and then Maker's Day. So the first part, headphone rule. This is maybe something that some of you know about. If you don't, make it your first rule that you evangelize company-wide. It is important. The rule is very basic. Headphones on equals do not disturb me. This is a way to make sure that people respect your time and that you have a kind of mutual way of signaling that, in fact, you are doing something work-related. So engineers put their headphones on, and that means that they're safe. You don't have to actively defend your time.
And this is a little bit of unofficial knowledge inside Heroku. I was actually in a manager's meeting, and our head of developer marketing was in this meeting, and he'd been here at the company about 2 months. And he said, something's changed recently. I seem to be getting snubbed more and more by developers. And when I got here, I was super welcome, and everyone was kind of shocked by this. We're generally try to be pretty inviting and welcoming, and so we started probing in on a little bit more. And he said, explained a situation where he walked up to a developer and stood there for about a minute and a half by his desk. And eventually the developer took out the headphones and he asked a question, and the developer gave a one-word answer and put his headphones back in. And so the rest of us, it was like, why would you go and interrupt him when his headphones are in and he's working and he's doing things? I would be upset too. But this is kind of one of those things where engineers completely get it, and we're working on cultivating this in other places. But it's one of those things where, engineers just get it. It makes sense. And I think, creating that environment in the rest of the organization really lets it flourish to what it should be.
Right. I mean, it's totally sociopathic behavior, but we got to do that, right? These are very high stakes. So caves and commons. Caves are places that you work. You have head down. It's maybe darker. Maybe you have a wall to your back so you don't have to worry about people peering over your shoulder. Just places that you are feeling safe. It's your cave. It's your man cave, or your programmer cave, right? But you dwell in commons. You need to have both of these things. Inside commons, that's where you interact with people. That's where you just happen to be hanging out at the kitchen, right? You weren't expecting to have a conversation, but there you are 20 minutes later, and now you have some great ideas. So keeping this separation between the two, I think is really important to strike this balance.
And I think this really depends on the personality too. We've got one guy at Heroku that almost constantly is in the caves of Heroku, the corners of the office, the hidden small rooms or the conference rooms, and he actually intentionally moves every 2 hours so people can't find him. So if you find out where he is in one, 2 hours later, he's going to be in a completely different one. And it's because he works well that way. So it's creating that environment. Can you work in a common area where there's conversation going on about interesting things, or do you work best heads down? And I think creating that environment for both to flourish is really important. Again, lets us actually create productive engineers.
Yeah, and Mark is our best ghost engineer, definitely. He haunts all over the place. So Maker's Day. There you go, 5 days a week. Maker's Day is Thursday, and on Thursday there are no meetings. You're not supposed to schedule meetings on Thursdays. That's your day to go out. Maybe you work from a coffee shop. Maybe you work from home. Maybe you just spend your entire day heads down. Thursdays are sacred. They're your time to, it's not exactly 20% time because we don't want to advocate necessarily working on things unrelated, but who knows, use your time as you see effective. A weird consequence of that, though, is that on Wednesday, that's when we have our all-hands meeting. That's when we have everybody at the company, either conference in, or we all go down in the basement and we have company-wide discussion about what's going on. So that's right after lunch. And even though it's right after lunch, for a developer, that means I have a meeting, so I can't get that 2 hour, 4 hour chunk in. Whatever. I'll schedule all my meetings for this. So Wednesday ends up being the de facto meeting day. All the meetings go on there, and then on Thursday you make up for it.
I think one of the important things about instituting something like a Maker's Day, and specifically on a specific day, is that engineers then feel empowered to say no when there's a request for a meeting. That's something that I commonly get a request, and it's easy to say no, it's Maker's Day, and that's a uniform thing. And some people will meet then, but it's definitely something we try to enforce of, giving you an opportunity to actually work on things, to get things done that you'd like to during the week. But having that uniform policy, because it's easy for an engineering manager to schedule something and the engineer feel obligated to actually to accept the meeting and skip that Maker's Day. But having a company-wide policy makes it a lot easier for them to actually feel like they can stand up to those kind of requests.
Right. Actually, that was one of my favorite things when joining the company. There was kind of a conversation of, what are you going to do on Maker's Day? It was a conversation you got excited about. It was like a holiday. So let's talk about the Allen curve. Not to read text from a slide, but the Allen curve, it describes this exponential drop in the amount of communication between people as their physical distance increases. This is something that was observed, I presume, by a guy named Allen, who, this is common sense, right? As you grow out, as you expand, as you stop seeing people as frequently, you just happen to, drop off communication-wise unless you actually work at it.
So, really what we aim to create is a culture for really, really productive engineers. And essentially what this means is, meetings are bad. This really ranges from team to team of, how many you have. But typically, there's not a lot of meetings. They're good for coordination, but for engineers, they typically don't like them. They're unproductive. They feel like they don't get a lot out of them. And you can do meetings well, but for us, less meetings is better. More time writing code is better. And this ranges from team to team. If I won't say we follow Agile strictly, but we adopt a lot of the principles. Certain teams do stand up in person daily. Certain teams do it on Skype. Certain teams do it via email. Certain teams don't at all. And this really varies by team. But the goal is to give engineers more productive time. And this comes with its own set of problems, which is then how do engineers communicate? Every team works with its own set of tools. GitHub's pretty unanimous, but some use Skype, some use Google Hangout, some use IM, some use Basecamp, some use Trello, some use Pivotal Tracker. We have probably as many tools as we do engineers, which creates a little bit of chaos. So it's easy to create productive engineers, but how do you actually then share knowledge well? So there's a few ways we do this, and part of this comes back to that designing good experiences. And we really aim to design everything we do at Heroku. And I'll get to the coffee in a minute of why am I up here brewing coffee. But our coffee process is actually very intentionally designed. So starting with lunch. This is a common thing for a lot of tech companies. It's a nice perk. It's a benefit. Here's lunch every day. I think what's unique to Heroku, we've done this for a long time, but when it started off at the beginning, it was one big table. And everyone was around the same table. It's still the same environment in that it's all in one place. Now we have to, have more than one long table. If we did have one long table, you still wouldn't be able to talk to people at the other ends. So we've got about 4 or 5 tables that hold about 12 people. But the idea is that you can cross-communicate with teams you wouldn't normally. So you're interacting with your normal team regularly, and now you get the opportunity to talk with other teams that you wouldn't typically.
Right. Also, note about the eclectic variety. We get crepes, we get some ramen, we have some hot pot, lots of different kinds, a lot of soups actually, which is sort of a weird kind of break from the pattern of food, which makes people, throws people off a little bit, makes them a little bit more willing to talk amongst themselves.
Yeah, it's actually a good kind of conversation starter when there's something that no one knows what it is.
How do I eat this?
It does happen.
That happens a lot.
So Beer Club happens every Friday. We couldn't actually find a picture last minute of the fridge and didn't get one before we left, but it's usually good, very good craft beer. Beer's always a good conversation, kind of enricher over drinking. I expect we'll see some of that tonight. But same idea, getting developers together, getting them the opportunity to talk.
In about an hour. Okay. Yeah.
And then finally, coffee. So coffee, we actually very intentionally designed our coffee process, thought through it and created it for a very specific purpose. It's actually really, really hard to make a single cup of coffee at Heroku. There are 2 ways to do it now, and that's because one person brought in an AeroPress. before there was a single way, and basically it was just hard to make a single cup of coffee, and it took about the same amount of time. So typically you're making a cup of coffee for 2 or 3 people. So we're big fans of Chemex. We have a lot of them in the office, and it's actually going to take about 10 to 15 minutes to make a cup. So what you're going to do is you're going to have to find someone to share it with, and then you're going to actually spend time making that coffee and have a conversation during it. So in the time that we've been up here, I cheated a little bit because we already had the grounds and we started warming up the water as we came up here. But in about 15 minutes, we've made a cup of coffee for 2 people, and had a similar type of conversation that we would have about collaboration or how we work or code we're working on, which really allows us to scale our communication where developers fail at cross-communicating between teams. We ship a lot of good code, and that's easy to do by just letting them work. But fixing the rest of our process of how we communicate through these other soft things really lets us go a lot further.
The other thing is that it's also a learnable and teachable craft. So people that are just starting at the company, people that maybe don't drink as much coffee, this is something that even if you don't have anything to talk about code-wise, maybe you're not even talking to a developer, or you don't have anything to talk about at all, you can teach the person how to brew coffee, which is just an ideal conversation. We do have some challenges, though. I have to say that a lot of the things that we've been talking about have centered around this amazing office that we've cultivated. But we've been understanding that more and more people are going to be remote, and we need to scale this out in a way that's virtualized. And we need to make sure that everybody feels looped in. And certainly, being pretty offset right now is making that clear to us. Actually, next week is remote week. The office is closed next week. Everybody works remotely, either from home, from coffee shop. In our case, from like Belgium or Stockholm, so that's going to be fun. Yeah, that's a little bit of an experiment for us. Like Craig said, we have as many tools as we do engineers, so maybe we should get that down at a certain point, but that's still a challenge for us. And then finally, there's something about Dunbar's number that Dunbar was a primatologist that observed that kind of the maximum number of the maximum group size, the maximum number of relationships that we can understand and consolidate in order to have a cohesive group is about 150. We're kind of rapidly growing to that number, so that's going to be a challenging precipice, and it's going to be kind of a fracturing point perhaps, so we have to really figure out how to scale beyond what our lizard brains kind of build in as a hard maximum. So
yeah, I think where I'd like to kind of leave this is a jumping off point for discussion for those of you that do have more distributed teams of what kind of processes do you create around improving communication and that kind of things where you have a lot of heads down engineers. Is it more process, which can sometimes work, but I have a similar opinion to Rafe on adding more process. I know GitHub's a largely remote team, and we know a lot of those guys, and they ship a lot of great code as well. So they have a similar model to us, and they ship a lot of things. They have productive engineers, but a different process for creating this kind of culture. So for those that are working in distributed formats, love to kind of have more conversation going on today and the rest of the conference about this of what things have you seen work around these challenges, and I'm sure we'll be experimenting and designing a lot more process or designing a lot of things, not necessarily process, to improve this going forward.
Sure, yeah. Talk to us over beers. Anyway, that's just about it. Thanks for